In this screencast, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of systems. The course is called Environmental Systems and Societies, and we use systems thinking. We draw a lot of systems diagrams to see how um, different processes and societies, you name it, how they interact as a whole rather than just the individual pieces of them. A classic system that you've already studied is an ecosystem, right? It's not just like one thing, it's a whole bunch of interacting parts and pieces. So the reason why we use a systems approach is because it can help us study really complex environmental issues. So the issue of global warming isn't just burning fossil fuel. There's a whole bunch of other things interacting with it, and looking at it as a whole will give us a better picture about what's actually happening. These systems help us model things in the end to figure out what to do. And the use of systems and models, it's doing is you're simplifying interactions. But you're trying to do it in a way so you've got a holistic view, and you're not just looking at just one piece of the system, you're looking at multiple pieces altogether to understand it more complexly, because one piece of a bicycle doesn't explain how a bicycle works. But if you look at the entirety of a bicycle, the wheels and the handlebars and the brakes, then you get a better idea about its functioning. So a system itself, just defined, it's an assemblage of parts, right? And the relationship between the parts. So with my example of the bicycle or a car or whatever that is, it's not just one of the parts. It's not just the wheel, or it's not just the pedals. It's the wheels and the pedals and the handlebars. And even can't even be like the person riding it. Like, how do those parts interact with each other? The chain goes around the gears, and which then turns the wheels. So all parts in the system are going to be linked and have some sort of impact on the other. And we can look at a number of different things as a system, whether it's the human body. We look at all those human body systems, a car, a bicycle, the economy. We apply systems thinkings to economics, societies, and of course, ecosystems is a very common one. There's going to be some key things about systems that they're all composed of. So all systems have storages and flows. They also have transfers. The flows can be transfers and transformations. We're going to look at those a little bit more closely with examples. But a transfer is when you take one part of the system and move it from one place to another, but you're just changing the location. Whereas a transformation, you're actually changing something in chemical nature, like whether it's moving from solid to liquid, which is a physical state, or chemical in nature if there's some sort of chemical reaction happening, or if energy is being passed or transformed somehow. Many systems also have feedback mechanisms, so some that can amplify changes, and others can actually trigger bringing that system back to an equilibrium type state. We'll probably get more into feedback mechanisms in the next unit, 1.3. Just giving you an idea that systems can be applied at a range of scales. They can be, quite small in scale, or they can be much larger. So here's just an idea. An ecosystem is an example of a system you're looking at. You might be tracing maybe just one thing in it. Maybe you're just tracing the energy movement in it. Maybe you're just tracing the carbon or the oxygen. So you can pick pieces of that and trace them, but do realize that all those interacting pieces will impact the others. So we could look at it in a smaller scale, or we could look at it in a much larger scale. So you can apply systems thinking not only to something as small as an ecosystem, but to the entire planet. Because here on Earth, we've got all of these different spheres that are interacting between the living organisms, the water, the atmosphere, the soil, and the earth. So all of these parts are interacting with each other. And I'll show you an example for sure where the biosphere and atmosphere are interacting continually. When you are actually making a systems diagram, there isn't any one set way to do it, but in general, you represent the storages as a rectangle or a box, but it could be a circle or even a drawing for that matter. And then the flows are the arrows within the direction of what's happening or where things are moving or how they're transforming. And often, I'll show you some examples where the size of the arrows or boxes will actually represent the size or magnitude of that storage or flow. So a bigger box means there's more stuff there. A bigger arrow means it's happening more rapidly, that transformation. So let's take a look at a couple of, here's a very simple systems diagram that I just did of the interaction of carbon, actually, and or energy in some cases, but I'll just say carbon within the, between the atmosphere and living organisms, right? So plants are constantly taking that carbon out of the atmosphere. So they take CO2 out of the atmosphere and they transform it into themselves, into living organisms. Now, there's a lot of steps down here, but plants themselves and other living organisms will also use that carbon that's, sugar or whatever that may be, to burn that. And when they burn that for energy, they let that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So we're watching carbon move between the atmosphere and living organisms in different forms. So it moves from the atmosphere, which is a storage, to living organisms, which is another storage, right? So in the atmosphere, it's stored as CO2. In living organisms, it's usually stored as some sort of organic matter, whether it's proteins or carbohydrates. And to get it from the atmosphere to living organisms, photosynthesis is used. And then from living organisms, eventually it gets put back into the atmosphere from that organic material into carbon dioxide again through cell respiration. Now, thinking about that, so I mentioned the storages, the atmosphere and the living organisms are the places where the carbon is stored. And then it's being moved, the flows between those through photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And because we're transforming it from, say, carbon dioxide to organic molecules, we consider that a transformation rather than a transfer, because it's not just changing location, it's actually changing in chemical nature. And the same when we go from organic molecules into carbon dioxide, we're actually changing the chemical nature. So it's both of these arrows we would consider to be transformations. Okay, so it's flowing between the atmosphere and the living organisms, but the type of flow is that it's a transformation. Okay. Here is another example of a systems diagram, and this is modeling nutrient flow. So if we were to maybe look at nutrients such as nitrogen, organic matter, things like that moving around within a biome or an ecosystem. So the boxes here represent where the nutrients are stored. And you can tell because of the size of the boxes that a lot more biomass, a lot more nutrients is stored in the biomass in the rainforest than it is in the temperate forest, right? In the temperate forest, it looks like most of the biomass or the nutrients is stored in dead organic matter and in the soil, and less is in the biomass. Where here in the tropical rainforest, most of the nutrients are within the living organisms themselves. And you can see the arrows are representing how it moves between these two storages, and the size of those arrows are going to indicate often the rate of the flow. So this is dead organic matter turning into soil. That would be decomposition, right? So this arrow is probably representing decomposition, and it's very thick here compared to here. So you can see that decomposition is much faster in the rainforest than it would be in a temperate forest. And the uptake and assimilation by plants is going to be much faster than it would be in the temperate forest as well. So there's going to be cases where you see that the size of the boxes indicates how much is there, and the actual size of the storage, and the size of the arrow is often representing the rate or how quickly things are being transferred or transformed. Here's just an example of what a question might look like on an IB exam. This is a glacier system, and you can see all these little parts. So if you were assuming that the total amount of ice in the glacier remains constant over the year, what is the value for R? You can hit pause and see if you can figure it out. And then after you hit play again, if it's going to be constant, then R should equal the two inputs minus the two outputs is what R should be if it's going to be constant size glacier every year. And you need to email me if you need help figuring that out. Here's another example of one I found on an exam. This one is really complicated, but it looks like a farming system. And so you can see all of the different movement of energy and foodstuffs and chemicals and pollutants. So this is a really complicated diagram. It looks like the arrows do represent the size of the flow. I'm not sure how well they have the boxes. Some of them are a little bit more complicated than others, but it's just representing that a farming system has a lot of complicated parts to it. You probably wouldn't be asked to draw one quite this crazy, but maybe you could analyze it with some questions. And then there's simple ones, just looking at the life cycle assessment of different materials. So your challenge, because I think that this is probably a systems diagram that you can manage, is to draw the water cycle. Good luck with that.